Hi, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this mini video will present some introductory concepts for Shakespeare's drama so that we can begin to build an understanding of Shakespeare's plays. Of course, we know that Shakespeare's plays are largely based on two genres, tragedy and comedy. We're going to talk about those a little bit more, and perhaps they're most well-known represented in the masks of the tragedy and comedy. Okay, so you've all seen these masks of some sort in some fashion. And so obviously, right, the sad face, the sad mask, that would be the tragedy. And the happy mask, right, would be the comedy, all specifying the types of endings, right? So the tragedy has the sad ending, and the comedy has the happy ending. Okay? All right. But before we get into the tragedy and comedy, I do want to make clear that actually Shakespeare has multiple genres within his plays, but four of them are significant: tragedy, comedy, history, and romance. Okay? Now, the history plays do draw on the concepts of tragedy and comedy, but their topic is very specific, and that is that it is about British history. So your Henry plays, Richard III, those would be considered history plays. Julius Caesar, however, would not be considered a history play because it is not about British history. It would be considered a tragedy. Okay? Um, the romances often follow the outlines of a comedy genre, but we have to think about romance in a little bit different way than we think about it in the 21st century. Romance at that time would have been more considered magical or fantasy, right? And so our romance plays allow for the possibility of magic. So examples of romance plays would be like A Midsummer Night's Dream or The Tempest. Now, before we get into discussing tragedy and comedy, I do want to talk to you a little bit about the Shakespeare theaters or the Renaissance theaters, or what we would call the Elizabethan theaters. I'm going to share my screen and show you a PowerPoint now. This PowerPoint is posted on the course Blackboard site along with this video, so you can review it there as well. Now, prior to Elizabeth, players would have just rambled about from village to village, performing, whatever was most popular at that time. But Elizabeth, because of her focus on raising up the arts as well as raising up patriotism to her and to England, she really began to nurture the theater. In fact, if we think about the difference between, say, the British Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance, it really would be the focus on theater, and the Italian Renaissance would be more focused on, the visual arts. But the open theaters, that we think about most notoriously, I think, would be like the Globe, those great big outdoor theaters that were absolutely massive and just held masses of people. And they would have been all day events. Families would have gone there to celebrate the day, and there would have been many things going on that culminated in the play. Okay. Open theaters were open to all the classes, from the peasants to the merchants to the lords to even the queen if she wanted to come. They were festival events that they would often raise the flag in one of those masks, perhaps, that I just showed you. And so you would know going into the theater whether or not you were going to see a tragedy or whether or not you were going to see a comedy. You would already know the ending of whether or not it was going to be a happy ending or a sad ending, right? Seating was very interesting in the outdoor theaters. Those that sat closest to the stage were actually the peasants. They didn't really have seats. They would have been sort of in the pit, but that would have been right next to the stage. And that's where you would have seen maybe bear baiting or cockfighting or other types of sort of, violent or body events happening down at the bottom. And then as you got further and further back, your classes went further and further up, right? So you might have the merchants behind the peasants, you might have the lords and the ladies behind the merchants, and then the queen would have been all the way to the back. Okay, so they were very egalitarian, these plays. Anybody could come, anybody could enjoy them. And actually, this is quite a challenge for the playwrights of the time, because they had to write plays that not only would the multiple, classes be able to enjoy, but that the queen would be able to hear in the very back. And of course, they had no microphones, no sound systems, no lighting systems. So they were very dependent on daylight, and they were very dependent on the weather. Eventually, they began to develop closed theaters. And if you have read the novel and Shakespeare, you saw the development of that happening. And closed theaters actually became much more of what we think of Broadway theaters now. They were much more exclusive, they were much more expensive. They really did focus mostly on the play. They did not have all of these other events going on. It was really an opportunity for the merchants and the lords to not have to associate, with the riffraff of the peasants. But for performers and for playwrights, it provided them with a much more stable environment for performing their plays. They were no longer so dependent on the weather. However, it's important to note, especially, in these days that we're living in now, both theaters were very, very subject to outbreaks of the plague. Okay. Additionally, with Shakespeare, the storylines were very, very predictable. As I said, we knew the happy ending. We knew there was going to be a closed, a sad ending. We knew from the title, right, who was going to die or who was going to get married. Maybe they were even performing well-known stories that people already knew, right? So plot was absolutely not that important for these plays. Historical accuracy, not important. What was important was examining the human interactions, understanding human experiences from different perspectives when faced with different challenges. All right, so let's get into the comedy a little bit. Most of you know, but I just want to make it clear that at this time, comedy was not considered what we consider today as something that's funny, haha, right? Situational comedies. No, in fact, comedies then were what we would think of today as romance, right? As our rom-coms, right? And so they always ended in a wedding. They were always supposed to have a happy ending. Of course, as soon as I give you these rules, I'm going to tell you that Shakespeare does mess around with that. And perhaps the reason why comedy comes down to us as this funny ha-ha is because the Shakespearean comedies did often draw on farce. Okay, so what is farce? Farce is physical humor, right? Slapstick kind of humor, people slipping and falling, that kind of stuff, and also a tremendous amount of confusion. So getting confused about who is what character, getting confused because they overhear something and they don't hear the whole situation, right? We know this kind of comedy. We're very familiar with it, but it is a huge part of Shakespeare's comedies. It is also a big part of Shakespeare's tragedies, but in those cases, that level of confusion is not comic, it is tragic, right? Farce also played into a lot of practical needs for Shakespeare. For example, I think most of you know that women were not allowed to perform on the stage back then. So men had to perform women's parts. So you will see a lot of gender bending in Shakespeare where men are women and women are men and they're back and forth, and this causes a lot of confusion. But also you just generally have people pretending to be someone else and in order to get into some kinds of situations or overhear or gather information, and that provides for that farcical comedy that is so much a part of Shakespeare's comedies. Okay? Again, always ends in a wedding. Wedding is supposed to be a happy ending, and that is for the main characters of the play. What is tragedy then? Tragedy, of course, we have our tragic hero. Now, we can discuss about, what makes a hero in Shakespeare's tragedies. But for now, let's just consider it as the hero or the heroes are the main character or characters of the play. So Romeo and Juliet would be our tragic hero and heroine of the play. We know that going in, we understand there are tragic heroes because they're the title and that they are going to die. We know that going in. Our tragic heroes also have some kind of tragic flaw, something that is about their being, either something that they're born into or something that is environmental, that is beyond their control. But because of that flaw, it leads to their eventual death. The tragic hero always dies on stage. So that's another important thing when we're thinking about performance of Shakespeare. We have the tragic heroes dying on stage. Others characters may die in a tragedy and they may die on or off stage. The tragic hero always dies on stage. And with that death, right, our tragic hero, because of its status within the society, with that death comes disorder and chaos. That is a little bit different than tragedies today. Tragedies today can be your common man, which does not result in social chaos. But in Shakespeare's time, there was a social class connected to the tragic hero, so much so that that death would cause some kind of chaos. For example, Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, the entire royalty is taken out, and so they are without leadership, allowing them to be vulnerable for invasion. Okay, that's pretty much what I want to talk to you about today. But I do want to mention just briefly Shakespeare's structure of his plays. I'm hoping that you can see this. I'm going to draw it. I'm hoping that you can see it okay. But if we think about the plot line structure of Shakespeare's plays, this will also give us some information, okay? So in Shakespeare's plays, they follow the Aristotelian view of what makes a proper drama. And that is that you had the buildup to a point, and then you had, okay, can you see that? I think so, right? You have the buildup here, and notice that it is equal, right, to the conclusion. This, of course, is the climax, the turning event, the turning point, right? So the buildup to this moment and the implications and the aftermath of the decisions made at the moment of climax. Okay? Now, therefore, in Shakespeare's plays, we know that the climax is going to come in Act 3, right? Shakespeare's plays are all 5-act plays, and the climax, therefore, has to come in Act 3. This is very different than today's movies, right? And today's drama that we might see. Instead, what we have today is really, right, we have a lot of buildup, right? A lot of buildup. We may have an extended climax and then very little conclusion afterwards. I use the Avengers as an example for those of you who know the Avengers, right? We have, take a look at Endgame. You could look at the whole franchise, but essentially you have buildup, 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 buildup. Then you have this extended battle scene right here, right? I don't know, that battle scene was at least 45 minutes long, where you have your main character make a decision. Now, you know who the main character is of Avengers if you've seen Endgame. That decision is the turning point in the battle, and then we have a very, very small conclusion. So this is very different than Shakespeare's. You're not looking at the end to find the climax. You're looking in Act 3, and then everything after that is the result of that climactic moment. So that is it for today. I will post more videos as we discuss more and more of Shakespeare's concepts. I hope that you have found this video useful and that it will help you as we begin to explore and enjoy some of Shakespeare's plays this semester.